On the 11th of November each year, we remember the fallen servicemen and women of the last 100 years, a tradition which started shortly after the end of the First World War. The Great War, as it was known at the time, dragged the world into the modern age of warfare. For millennia, mankind had fought on land and sea, but it was during the Great War they realised there was a whole new way of fighting, in the air. Worse still, it wasn't limited solely to the battlefield. Vast airships, the length of 2 football pitches, could now bomb civilians with impunity. For months, airships loomed out of the night, bombed British cities, and then disappeared back into the darkness, almost completely unharmed. That is until one daring young pilot used new technology and tactics, and finally brought one down. He was immediately recommended for the Victoria Cross, the highest award for gallantry in the face of the enemy, and the first VC action over British soil. He became a celebrity overnight, but the glory was short-lived, as he became a prisoner of war and suffered terribly at the hands of his captors. This is the epic and tragic story of Captain William Leefe-Robinson VC. William Leefe-Robinson was born on the 14th of July 1895 in India to a family with a long naval tradition. He was educated at St Bees School in Cumbria, and while not academically brilliant, he was a keen sportsman, musician, and a somewhat lovable rogue. Due to his father's successful coffee plantation, William and his siblings had a privileged upbringing. On one occasion, he spent a very long summer holiday in Russia that went on so long it put him and his brother back in their studies when they finally did return to school. He regularly wrote to his teetotal father about his schooling and leisure time, and always sounded very keen, happy, and carefree. At 17 years old, he wrote in one letter to his parents, "Thursday morning we went to the Tate Gallery. It was ripping!" The whole week sounds like that. By January 1913, he'd decided he wanted to join the army, and had his next few years all planned out. But, as the author of his biography, Ray Rimmel, put it, the world had other ideas, and Robinson would end up in the army somewhat sooner than he planned. 10 days after the declaration of war, Robinson was at Sandhurst. A fellow officer cadet remembered him as one of those happy mortals able to shine at work or play without apparent effort. He was extremely modest, and I never knew him lose his temper. His penchant for roguish pranks continued at Sandhurst, such as the time he and a friend borrowed some dragoons' horses during a training exercise, and later glued someone's bayonet into its scabbard. After 5 months' training, he joined the Worcestershire Regiment. He was immediately posted to a training depot, was extremely bored, and kept applying for overseas posts either to France, Africa, or India. In March 1915, he wrote, "This war is sickening. The other day I heard of the death of a great friend of mine at school. He was one of the best fellows. And there are several awfully nice Sandhurst men I knew who have met the same fate. Yet I am longing to get out somehow. I want to be doing something." Reading that quote, I'm always put in mind of Lieutenant George from the last episode of Blackadder Goes Forth, when he's listing all the members of the Trinity Tiddlers, his old school and university friends. By the end of March 1915, Robinson finally got a transfer and a chance of some action when he was posted to No. 4 Squadron, Royal Flying Corps, based at Saint-Omer in France. His role there was as an observer flying BE-2Cs, spotting enemy troop and artillery locations. It's worth noting here that the BE-2 stood for Blériot Experimental No. 2. In the early days, the observers would hand-sketch the enemy positions and then drop the drawings in a weighted bag over friendly trenches. Later on, they started using very early aerial photography and radios to communicate with ground forces. It's also worth mentioning here the speed at which technology was advancing. The Wright brothers proved in December 1903 that heavier-than-air flight was possible when they flew 10 feet off the ground for 120 feet. Just 12 years later, Robinson wrote, "You've no idea how beautiful it is above the clouds. At 5 o'clock on a still afternoon, how glorious it is to gaze at the earth at 7,000 feet. A real beauty comes with the clouds. Those rolling wastes of vapour of 100 shades, fading away until they terminate at the horizon." On the 7th of May 1915, having just written to his mother telling her not to worry about him, and that the RFC only has a 5% casualty rate, he became one. Around 5 a.m, over the French town of Lille, a shell burst caught him in the arm and caused him to bleed all over his maps. Surgeons later pulled 2 bits of shrapnel out of his arm, and he later found a lucky penny in his top pocket that was now severely bent, having seemingly stopped another piece of shrapnel that hit his chest. After 6 weeks recovering back in Britain, he decided to have a go at actually flying the planes himself. On the 30th of June 1915, he made his first flight as a pilot and went solo on the 18th of July. 10 days later, he qualified as a pilot with just under 3.5 hours flying time. By the end of 1915, he wrote to his mother explaining that he was now signed off to fly at night, and signed off one letter with Billy the Birdman. By the end of the Victorian period, the Industrial Revolution had completely changed the world, and everyone realised how bad this could be if and when the fighting started on a grand scale. In 1899, the Hague Declaration was drawn up to stop countries launching projectiles or explosives from balloons or other kinds of aerial vessels. When it came up for renewal in 1907, only 27 of the 44 countries involved put their signature to it. Germany wasn't one of them. By September 1914, the German High Command were thinking of bombing London to force Britain to surrender, but both the Chancellor and the Kaiser were against it. Kaiser Wilhelm was a cousin of George V, remember. However, on the 10th of January 1915, after much badgering from German admirals, the Kaiser relented and permission was given. The order sent out was air attacks on England approved by Supreme Warlord, targets not to be attacked in London, but rather docks and military establishments in the lower Thames and on the English coast. The last time a foreign invader had attacked mainland Britain was in the late 1700s, well over a century earlier. From January to September 1915, there were 39 raids mounted on London, killing 439 people and wounding 980. One very successful raid caused over £500,000 worth of damage. That's around 48 million today. The press dubbed the airships baby killers, and the British Army and the Royal Navy argued over whose job it was to stop them. On the 12th of September, Admiral Percy Scott was given the job. He had 75mm guns mounted on trucks for greater mobility, and reorganised the RFC and the RNAS to work together. He also set up new airfields in Essex and West London, with pilots on permanent standby. Thus far in the war, anti-airship tactics involved getting above the ship and dropping bombs or explosive darts on them. The issue was getting above them, as the airships could often climb faster than the planes sent to intercept them. The interceptors used at the time took almost a full hour to get to 10,000 feet. On the 13th of October 1915, an airship raid killed 71 people and injured 130 more. Only one of the 5 planes sent to intercept it managed to find it, and the pilot looked on in vain as the airship simply pointed her nose upwards and climbed out of range. By January 1916, German airships were bombing the industrial hearts of the Midlands. The issues the top brass faced was that airships attacked at night, so you often couldn't see them until they were already attacking, and most weapons lacked the potency to deal with them. Ground-based guns were often inaccurate, and regular bullets had little effect. Airships aren't like a regular balloon. They're made up of lots of different bags of gas under the skin. Regular bullets just pass straight through, and although some gas escapes, it's got plenty more to hold it up. It's a bit like poking a very large sponge with a very small needle. All sorts of other ammunition was tried, such as explosive darts, rockets, bombs, fiery grapnels, and tracer rounds. Eventually, the top brass realised they needed explosive bullets. After much experimentation, the RFC began using 4 different types of explosive and incendiary bullets that used elements like phosphorus and magnesium. Take these and then fire them from a machine gun into a giant floating ball of hydrogen gas the length of 2 football pitches, and you get an aerial display that rivals any November the 5th or 4th of July. At least that was the theory. Now they just needed a suitable plane and someone brave or mad enough to test the theory in combat. The BE-2C was slow but steady and stable in flight. Not very good against fast German fighters over the trenches, but a brilliant observer or night fighter. Remember, this is still very early days of flying. The pilot is sat on a wickerwork seat with a single seatbelt. He's wrapped in numerous layers of clothing and has whale oil smeared on his face to keep the cold out. He sat in an open cockpit with no canopy, no oxygen tank, no radio, no heating, very few lights, and no parachute. For communications and signalling, the pilot had a flare gun. For offence, he had a rear-facing Lewis gun that was tilted upwards with a guide bar to stop him shooting his own tail off. And for defence, he had his wit, his skill, and luck. On the night of the 25th of April 1916, one of Robinson's colleagues engaged a Zeppelin at 11 p.m, flying around 14,000 feet above northeast London. Captain Arthur Harris engaged LZ-97 with his Lewis gun loaded with the new explosive ammo, but the gun jammed twice. While clearing the jam, the searchlights lost sight of the airship and it vanished into the darkness. Harris complained that his aircraft couldn't climb fast enough. Robinson also attempted to engage LZ-97, but his Lewis gun jammed 5 times. Pilots had differing ideas on why the guns jammed. Some said it was the oil used to lubricate them that froze at altitude. But if they didn't lubricate the guns, then they might not work at all. Night flying was extremely difficult in these early days. Their landing strips were supposedly marked with a giant glowing letter L, but many pilots, including Robinson, struggled to see them. On the 31st of January 1916, 20 planes took off to patrol the skies, but 8 were damaged on landing, and 2 pilots were killed after crashing on takeoff. That's a 50% accident rate and a 10% fatality rate. 4 months later, they were getting the hang of the taking off and landing, but the engaging airships bit in the middle was still tricky. Robinson seemed to take it personally because he vowed that the next airship he met, it would be a case of either the Zepp or I. The fear caused by these spooky raiders occupied the minds of the population like nothing else. The writer D.H. Lawrence described the spectacle of a Zeppelin raid thus. There was a war in the heaven. The moon is not the queen of the sky by night, and the stars the lesser lights. It seems the Zeppelin is in the zenith of the night, having taken control of the sky, and the bursting shells are the lesser lights. By September 1916, the country was reeling from the ongoing Battle of the Somme. A battle that claimed the lives of 20,000 British soldiers on the first day, and 40,000 more wounded. By the end of the battle, in November, Britain suffered 420,000 casualties, of which 100,000 were killed or missing. As if losing loved ones in France wasn't bad enough, the airships were still bringing death and destruction on British soil. Britain had been used to the isolation offered by the English Channel and the protection of the Royal Navy, then the world's largest navy. Despite all this, the German airships seemed to appear out of the night like enormous phantoms, leave fear and death in their wake, and nothing seemed to be able to stop them. The population needed a morale boost, and the armed forces needed a victory. On the 2nd of September 1916, the German Army and Navy, working together, launched 16 airships in total to raid London. 2 types were used, including our old friend LZ-97, that was a Zeppelin, and a different type of airship called a Shutte-Lanz. Zeppelins were made with metal frames, and SLs were made with wooden frames and had a different configuration, but both had broadly the same capabilities and purpose. To the Jane and Joe public, they were all known as Zeppelins, but Zeppelins were a specific make, a bit like vacuum cleaners are referred to as Hoovers. However, I think if you tried explaining the difference to a Londoner at the time, it would be a bit like trying to explain to someone being attacked by a big cat that it was a lion and not a tiger. It's not really the biggest thing on their mind at the time. Among the vast fleet was SL-11, a brand new Shutte-Lanz airship flying out of Spick near Cologne in Germany, that had been launched just a month earlier. She weighed 21 tons, was 174 metres long, 20 metres wide, and used 38,780 cubic metres of hydrogen to stay airborne, and had a top speed of nearly 60 miles an hour. Eventually, bad weather, bad visibility, and various mechanical faults forced many of the airships to return to base, including LZ-97, who turned tail over the Essex coast and would live to fight another day. SL-11 pressed on, however, and became one of only 2 out of the 16 airships launched that managed to reach London. SL-11 began dropping her bombs on parts of North London and Hertfordshire. She was forced to alter course while flying over Alexandra Palace due to heavy anti-aircraft fire from Finsbury and Victoria Parks. Robinson was on patrol that night and had already failed to engage another airship. Just after 2 a.m, he spotted SL-11 when she was around 11,000 feet over Goff's Oak. Despite coming to the end of his patrol time, he decided to engage. He began flying through the friendly anti-aircraft fire to get as close as possible. When he decided he was close enough, he fired a bright red flare as a signal to the gunners on the ground to stop firing and let me have a go, chaps. The guns stopped. The population of London looked up and held their breath. It must have looked like a minnow attacking a whale. Around 2:15 a.m, Robinson flew below the airship and fired his Lewis gun into her belly, emptying his magazine of 40 rounds in around 4 seconds. A mixture of incendiary and explosive rounds did nothing. He reloaded and made another pass. Still nothing. The whale didn't even seem to know he was there, because the crew never fired back. He reloaded his final magazine and hoped it would be third time lucky. He'd flown far longer than his allotted patrol time and was low on fuel. This was his last chance. Rather than a strafing run, he aimed at a single point of the hull toward the tail and fired. Before he'd finished emptying the magazine, the ship started to glow pink. The pink turned to red as the fire burnt right through the middle of the ship and burst out of the tail. In his biography of Robinson, Ray Rimmel tells us, "Blazing strips of fabric peeled away in scorched tatters as the doomed airship hung momentarily, its girders hissing and spitting in the heat. The whole sky seemed to be ablaze, and the massive conflagration lit up the ground below for a radius of over 60 miles. People as far as Cambridge and Reigate saw the sky turn red. The searchlights switched off as the sky lit up like an early sunrise. One person likened it to a piece of metal that a blacksmith had pulled out of the furnace. SL-11 still drifted forwards, but her nose began to drop as the flames grew in intensity. A journalist for Flight magazine watched the spectacle from 10 miles away. He wrote, 'The slow speed at which she fell was amazing to me. I had expected once she got nose down to see her move at a terrific pace, but the mammoth appeared to be a huge mass of flame supported by a parachute. At around 5,000 feet, he heard a crackling noise, like exploding ammunition or twisting timber. Then she disappeared behind the trees with a crash and a final flare flashed up.' He estimated that it took 3 or 4 minutes from ignition of the gas to her final crash into the ground, which he likened to plunging hot iron into water." Robinson had the closest view and said, "I saw my machine as if in the firelight and sat half dazed staring at the wonderful sight before me, not realising the wonderful thing that had happened. The people on the ground erupted into cheers and God Save the King rang out. The 16 airship raid had been a failure. They dropped 32 tons of bombs and caused £21,000 worth of damage, 12 injuries and 4 deaths. But they'd lost £93,000 worth of airship and an experienced crew of 16 men who all perished in the wreckage. SL-11 hit the ground in a fireball in the village of Cuffley at around 2:20 a.m. Robinson landed safely at 2:45 a.m. with his petrol tank almost empty. His ground crew and fellow pilots met him with an ear-splitting yell and carried him out of the plane and into the flight office. He was stiff with cold and cramp and deaf due to his rapid descent, but he'd done it. Upon examination, they discovered he'd shot away part of his own tail as the guide bar had snapped. He was tired, but unhurt. When the actual sun rose a few hours later, there was very little of the airship left. The vast wooden and fabric hull had been incinerated. All that remained were her engines and miles of metal cables that the military and police had to recover before souvenir hunters got there first. The whole wreckage fitted inside an area a bit over 20 square metres. There is some irony in that the commander of SL-11, Wilhelm Schramm, had been born in Kent in 1885 because his father was an engineer in London. At 30 years old, he was killed around 30 miles away from his birthplace. The hysteria lasted for days. In 48 hours, 10,000 people had descended on the sleepy little Hertfordshire village of Cuffley, and Robinson was recommended for the Victoria Cross, possibly the fastest recommendation in the 160-year history of the medal. The RFC was ordered to give the crew a proper military funeral. They were placed in ash coffins ready for burial at the nearby town of Potter's Bar, and 370 police officers were dispatched to keep the peace, as civilians had little sympathy for men they regarded as baby killers. The funeral took place on the 6th of September, the same day that 2 sisters were being buried just a few miles away at Essendon after being killed by bombs from another airship the same night. Although there were threats of riots, the only show of aggression was a woman throwing eggs who was arrested and fined 5 shillings. At 15:10, the buglers of the Grenadier Guards played the last post over the graves. Just a week after the event, 9th of September, Robinson was awarded his VC by George V at Windsor Castle. He was mobbed by adoring crowds everywhere he went, but always insisted that he just did his job. He'd proved that the new tactic of flying below an airship with an upward-facing Lewis gun loaded with incendiary and explosive ammunition worked. Utilising his methods, other members of his squadron had similar successes, including his good friend Frederick Sowry, who brought down Zeppelin L-32 less than a month later. Most of all, he'd given the people hope and proof that the baby killers could be beaten. Before the end of 1916, 7 more airships were brought down using Robinson's tactics. The loss of SL-11 made the German army lose interest in raiding Britain, and many in the German top brass lost faith in the wooden-framed SLs, favouring the metal-framed Zeppelins. The German Navy persisted with Zeppelin raids, but the last raid on London took place in October 1917 and was an unmitigated disaster for Germany. London implemented an almost full blackout. With all searchlights turned off, the German crews, who were now flying up to 20,000 feet, couldn't pick out any targets. They suffered freezing temperatures and oxygen deprivation. Very few bombs were dropped, and none of the Zeppelins made it back to base as wind conditions blew them off course. Some were brought down by Allied defences in France, and some were blown as far as the Mediterranean, where they ran out of fuel and crashed. The last airship raid on Britain was in August 1918, when 4 Zeppelins attempted to bomb the north of England, but bad weather and fighter interception meant none of their bombs hit land. This raid also caused the death of Peter Strasser, the commander of all airships in the German Navy, who'd come along as an observer. Robinson continued flying, but narrowly escaped disaster just a week after receiving his medal. On the 16th of September, he caught a hedge on takeoff, and the plane nosedived into the ground. Although he was uninjured, the plane caught fire, and he managed to jump clear just before the explosive darts he was carrying detonated. His trusty BE-2C, with tail number 2693, the scourge of the baby killers, was burnt to a crisp. After this, he flew very little for the remainder of 1916, but not through choice. Instead, the top brass got him on all sorts of official visits to show him off and keep him safe. He also got engaged to a widow by the name of Joan Whipple, whose husband had been killed in 1914. None of their letters survive, but he described her to his parents as the best girl on God's earth. By February 1917, he was posted to France flying a new plane, the Bristol F-2A. On the 6th of April, Robinson's squadron, of which he was in charge, were engaged by the legendary Red Baron and his Jagdstaffel. The RFC lost many planes that day, and Robinson's was seen to spiral out of the sky billowing smoke. As far as everyone knew, the hero of Cuffley was dead. Weeks passed until his fiancée received a letter via the Red Cross. Robinson had survived the false landing and been taken prisoner. Despite living quite comfortably as a prisoner, he and 2 friends began digging a tunnel to escape. This came to nothing, but many more attempts were made, which included bribery, more tunnelling, and even walking out of a camp hidden behind a heavily loaded washing line. Eventually they escaped by abseiling out of a window and nearly made it to freedom, but a sentry caught them just 4 miles from the Swiss border. After numerous attempted escapes from various different camps and fortresses, he became a marked man, even more so for having the VC. After spells in solitary confinement, he suffered malnutrition, sleep deprivation, harassment, and at least one incident of being physically whipped to the point of collapse. He was repatriated to Britain after the armistice, and his ship docked in Edinburgh on the 14th of December 1918. His friends and family noted that the once tall and dashing young pilot was now stooped and walked with a stick. Frail, and no doubt suffering a weakened immune system, Robinson wasn't prepared for the flu virus that was rampant at the time. Around Christmas time, he was confined to his bed, and finally, on Tuesday the 31st of December 1918, he died, aged just 23. He was buried on the 3rd of January 1919, with full honours, and even a flypast by the fledgling Royal Air Force, who dropped a wreath for their fallen friend. The flu virus after the war infected anything up to 500 million people around the globe, and killed up to 100 million of its victims. The worst epidemic in history, and perhaps something we all have a bit more appreciation for now. It's such a tragic and cruel irony for Robinson to survive multiple enemy engagements, experimental aircraft, much of it at night, being hit by shrapnel, at least 2 plane crashes, various prisoner of war camps with all the pain and horror that brought him over a period of almost 2 years, to die of flu just 2 weeks after returning home. I often wonder what kind of career he would have had being such a gifted and decorated pilot. Many of his fellow pioneering night-fighting colleagues went on to great things. Fred Sowry, who brought down an airship using Robinson's tactics less than a month after the Cuffley event, went on to receive the Distinguished Service Order, the Military Cross, and the Air Force Cross. He retired in 1940 with the rank of Group Captain. His son rose to be Air Marshal Sir Frederick Sowry, KCB, CBE, AFC, and eventually became Director of Defence Policy with the Ministry of Defence. Arthur Harris, the young captain who was thwarted in his attempt to shoot down an airship because the gun kept jamming, went on to become Marshal of the Royal Air Force, Sir Arthur Harris, 1st Baronet, GCB, OBE, AFC, commonly known as Bomber Harris because he ran the British bombing campaign in the Second World War. Where might Robinson have ended up had he lived? Throughout the war, airships dropped 5,000 bombs, causing the deaths of 557 people, injuries to 1,358 people, and £1.5 million in damages, 75 million today. The First World War catapulted the world into the modern age. It started with cavalry charges in brightly coloured uniforms, and it finished with tanks, planes, camouflage, aerial photography, gas masks, radios, inter-service cooperation, and tactics that would still be recognised by troops fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan in the next century. It brought war to British soil for the first time in well over 100 years, and at the forefront of its defence we had pioneering fighting men like William Leefe-Robinson, the first person awarded the VC for an action over British soil. In 1988, his VC was sold at auction for £99,000, about $227,000 today, with the proceeds being used to set up a charity for children recovering from leukemia. A fitting legacy for a hero who died of illness rather than combat.